Suspended in the terrifying and absolute silence of the second Lagrange point, the pristine gold-coated beryllium mirrors of the James Webb Space Telescope must maintain a brutal operating temperature of exactly 7 Kelvin to relentlessly pierce through the deepest and most impenetrable dust clouds of the ancient cosmic abyss without generating their own blinding and destructive infrared thermal interference. Pointing its exceptionally sensitive near-infrared camera toward a seemingly empty and unremarkable patch of the northern celestial hemisphere, the multi-billion-dollar observatory begins to silently collect ancient primordial photons that have been traveling through the freezing vacuum of space for over 13 billion years to reach its exquisitely calibrated and desperately waiting digital optical sensors. Instead of detecting the expected scattered array of primordial infant galaxies forming in the cosmic dawn, the raw telemetry data transmitted back to the NASA Command Center reveals an impossible, pitch-black void stretching across a mind-bending diameter of over 1 billion light-years, where absolutely no baryonic matter or standard thermodynamic radiation should theoretically be able to hide from our sight. Surrounding the jagged and unnatural edges of this monstrous and terrifying abyss, the captured imagery displays an utterly chaotic web of extreme gravitational lensing that actively and violently tears the light from distant background star systems into shattered, unrecognizable optical smears that completely and unapologetically defy every mathematically accepted model of standard cosmic mass distribution. According to the foundational equations of Albert Einstein's general relativity, gravity should smoothly warp the fabric of space-time into predictable geometric curves. Yet, this hypermassive structure bends passing radiation at impossibly sharp and jagged right angles that suggest the very structural foundation of the universe is fundamentally fractured in this specific isolated region of the cosmic web. Panicked astrophysicists stationed at the Space Telescope Science Institute scrambled desperately to recalibrate their software and isolate potential hardware malfunctions, refusing to believe that an optical anomaly of this catastrophic magnitude could exist without completely nullifying the last 100 years of established astrophysical orthodoxy and standard model physics we rely upon to understand reality. However, as successive and uninterrupted packets of raw, uncompressed optical data continue to stream down through the deep space network with a staggering 99.7% signal anomaly rate, the agonizing and horrifying truth becomes entirely undeniable to the deeply terrified researchers who are left staring blankly at their glowing analytical monitors in the dead of the unforgiving night. This localized breakdown of physical reality is not merely a static and dead remnant of some ancient cosmological collision, but rather a hyperdynamic and aggressively expanding space-time rupture that actively consumes surrounding galactic filaments while violently and permanently rewriting the foundational constants of gravity in its immediate and utterly inescapable local vicinity across millions of parsecs. The sheer scale of the mathematical violation embedded within these mid-infrared readings forces humanity to confront the sickening possibility that the cosmological parameters we have blindly trusted to govern our seemingly safe solar system are nothing more than localized planetary illusions that are about to be violently shattered by an incomprehensible force from the deepest and darkest regions of the void. As the frantic data analysts run their final diagnostic checks and completely rule out any possibility of a mundane instrumental error aboard the JWST, a single, blood-chilling question echoes through the silent corridors of the observation facility. What kind of nightmarish cosmic entity or apocalyptic structural failure possesses the sheer terrifying power to completely break the laws of Einstein's universe? As the horrifying telemetry packets from the second Lagrange point filter silently into ground stations across the globe, and suffocating wave of profound existential dread washes over the world's leading astrophysicists, paralyzing elite research institutions with the sickening realization that humanity's most cherished intellectual achievements are built upon a foundation of sand. For over 4 centuries, human civilization has comfortably insulated itself within the gentle comfort of the cosmological principle, naively assuming that our localized laws of nature were universal truths. Yet this impossible void proves that our tiny, fragile, pale blue dot exists in an utterly microscopic pocket of temporary sanity, floating amidst an incomprehensibly hostile and chaotic ocean of non-Euclidean space-time. In the agonizing quiet of university lecture halls and subterranean research bunkers, brilliant minds who spent their entire lives mastering theoretical physics now stare silently into the abyss of their own sudden ignorance, confronting an intoxicating yet terrifying sense of cosmic isolation as they realize that the universe is not merely indifferent to our presence, but actively incomprehensible to the limitations of human intellect. The deeply terrifying philosophical reality settling over the scientific vanguard is that mathematics itself, long revered as the infallible and divine language of the cosmos, may be nothing more than a localized hallucination, crafted by biological brains, trapped inside a tiny cosmic bubble, where entropy and gravity happen to behave with deceptive predictability for a brief and fleeting blip of astronomical time. This overwhelming revelation recontextualizes the ancient mystery of the Fermi Paradox through a terrifying new lens, suggesting that the reason we hear only absolute silence when listening to the distant stars is not because intelligent civilizations are rare, but because every advanced species eventually reaches this exact technological threshold only to discover that the fabric of physical reality is fundamentally collapsing around them. All our glorious space probes, magnificent orbital telescopes, and hyper-complex particle accelerators are suddenly reduced to primitive wooden toys, poking aimlessly at the edges of an unknowable, monstrous leviathan that operates according to rules so alien and hostile that merely perceiving them threatens to fracture the fragile collective psychological sanity of our unsuspecting, fragile species. Where humanity once saw a grand, harmonious cosmic architecture designed with elegant symmetry and beautiful mathematical balance, we are now forced to peer directly into a dark and lawless abyss, where physical constants shift like shifting desert sands and fundamental forces decay into unpredictable, agonizing chaos, without a single shred of warning or mercy for the trillions of lives caught in their path. As prominent astrophysicists quietly whisper their darkest doubts in emergency executive sessions behind tightly locked doors, a quiet existential panic spreads through the global scientific community, leaving researchers paralyzed by the horrifying awareness that every textbook, formula, and paper ever written in human history is now entirely obsolete and utterly useless for predicting what comes next. The comfortable belief that our species occupies a central, meaningful position within a logical universe vanishes in a single instant, replaced by the chilling realization that we are merely accidental, brief spectators watching the terrifying final unraveling of a cosmic reality that was never designed to sustain life, order, or comprehension in the first place, across the endless, freezing expanse of time. If the foundational laws governing the entire universe are not eternal, invariant truths, but merely fragile, localized illusions that can violently shatter at any moment, how long do we truly have before this expanding tide of absolute physical lawlessness inevitably reaches our own unsuspecting solar system and systematically erases every single atom of human existence from the cold, unremembering cosmic record? More than a century ago, within the quiet intellectual sanctuaries of 1917, Albert Einstein peered deeply into the foundational mathematical framework of his recently published general theory of relativity. and realized with a growing, inescapable unease that his incredibly elegant equations inherently predicted a highly unstable universe destined to violently collapse upon its own immense gravity. Desperately attempting to artificially stabilize this terrifying apocalyptic prediction and enforce a much more comfortable illusion of eternal cosmic permanence, the legendary physicist introduced an arbitrary mathematical patch known as the cosmological constant directly into his otherwise pristine field equations, entirely unaware that this desperate theoretical safeguard would one day completely and utterly fail. When the brilliantly observant astronomer Edwin Hubble conclusively proved during the pivotal 1920s that distant galactic clusters were actually accelerating away from our Milky Way at truly blistering speeds, a humiliated Einstein famously retracted his stabilizing constant and openly declared the arbitrary mathematical insertion to be the absolute greatest blunder of his entire prestigious scientific career. Yet, as paralyzed modern astrophysicists stare intensely at the extremely chilling mid-infrared spectrometry data currently pouring in from the James Webb Space Telescope, they are collectively realizing, with absolute unadulterated horror, that Einstein's famously discarded cosmological constant was not actually a mistake, but rather a profoundly tragic underestimation of a vastly darker, repulsive force hiding in the void. This incomprehensible billion-light-year-wide anomaly, newly recorded at the frozen edge of the observable universe, entirely bypasses the established theoretical limits of standard relativistic physics, terrifyingly demonstrating that the actual vacuum of space possesses a malignant amount of raw negative pressure capable of violently shredding the fundamental binding forces of ordinary baryonic matter into nothingness. Forgotten historical records locked away deep within restricted university archives reveal that several highly obscure theoretical physicists, working quietly in the dark shadow of the famous Manhattan Project, had briefly hypothesized the exact existence of this localized space-time decay, but their highly terrifying calculations were quickly suppressed and permanently discarded as completely impossible mathematical artifacts. We are now painfully and agonizingly discovering that these brilliant yet heavily marginalized early thinkers were actually entirely correct, as the horrific gravitational distortions actively captured by the primary optical mirrors of the JWST perfectly matched their forgotten century-old predictions of a fundamentally unstable universe that is aggressively tearing its own fabric apart along invisible hyperdimensional lines. By desperately and stubbornly clinging to Einstein's comforting initial assumption of a completely smooth and continuous cosmic geometry, countless successive generations of modern scientists have effectively blinded our entire species to the horrifying reality that our physical reality is heavily scarred by extremely violent topological defects operating completely outside the boundaries of standard measurable thermodynamics. The absolute and undisputed failure of general relativity to mathematically explain this monstrously gaping wound in the cosmic tapestry basically guarantees that our most heavily advanced astrophysical frameworks are nothing more than comforting children's stories we desperately tell ourselves to hide from the unfathomable darkness of a terrifyingly cold universe that actively rejects the existence of structured solid matter. If the absolute greatest theoretical scientific mind in recorded human history completely failed to mathematically predict or contain the horrifying apocalyptic nature of this aggressively expanding spatial anomaly, what exactly happens to our fragile little world when this localized breakdown of fundamental space-time inevitably breaches the distant outer boundaries of the Milky Way and violently rewrites the laws of physics? Supercomputers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory are now generating chilling, high-fidelity visualizations based on the JWST telemetry, projecting a future where this specific localized regions of physical lawlessness begin to metastasize and spread across the cosmic web like an unstoppable, virulent dark cancer. We witness the terrifying simulation of entire spiral galaxies, each home to hundreds of billions of stars and theoretical civilizations, suddenly encountering the advancing front of the anomaly, causing the very laws of gravity within them to abruptly collapse into absolute and utterly unpredictable chaos. Instead of maintaining stable orbits, the visualizers show millions of solar systems being violently ripped apart by catastrophic hypergravitational shear forces that shred planets down to the atomic level and stretch stars into thin, glowing filaments of dying plasma before extinguishing them forever. As the simulated infection propagates outward at the speed of light, we see the very constants of the universe, such as the velocity of photons and the fundamental strength of the strong nuclear force, oscillating violently inside the affected regions, rendering chemistry and atomic stability completely impossible. Vast halos of invisible dark matter, which typically act as the protective scaffolding for galactic clusters, are instantly destabilized in these projections, causing them to explode outward and trigger the ultimate dissolution of grand cosmic structures that took billions of years to patiently form in the early universe. For any hypothetical intelligent species living within a targeted galaxy, the simulation depicts a truly horrifying scenarios where their sky instantly transforms into a chaotic, psychedelic nightmare as distant starlight is bent into impossible geometric patterns right before their local physics fail and they are annihilated instantly. The most disturbing aspect of these projections is the realization that this spreading chaotic influence is not merely destroying existing matter, but is actively consuming the very fabric of spacetime itself, leaving behind a sterile and incomprehensible void that is completely detached from the dimension of time as we know it. Astrophysicists analyzing the models conclude that if this localized fracture in general relativity continues to expand at its current calculated rate, it could theoretically reach the boundaries of our own Milky Way galaxy within a few billion years, which is a horrifyingly short blip on the grand chronological scale of the cosmos. This represents a terrifying new perspective on the ultimate fate of the universe, shifting from the slow, predictable cooling of the traditional Big Freeze theory to a sudden, violent, and utterly chaotic rewriting of reality that leaves absolutely no room for the survival of complex baryonic matter. As the traumatic digital visualization concludes, with a chilling shot of our own local group of galaxies being reduced to shattered cosmic dust, the only lingering and crucial question is whether our current fundamental model of physics can survive the scrutiny of the deeply unsettling technical data that is currently streaming back from the edge of the abyss. Deep inside the mid-infrared instrument aboard the James Webb Space Telescope, where a specialized helium loop cryocooler maintains a brutal operating temperature of just 6.7 Kelvin to eliminate ambient thermal noise, primary sensor arrays detect an impossible infrared glow emanating from the dark core of the anomaly that completely defies every known law of classical thermodynamics and blackbody radiation physics. Targeting the mid-infrared spectra between 5 and 28 micrometers, the instrument records massive energy flux measurements that suggest an impossibly high heat signature without any corresponding mass density or observable atomic matter to generate it, effectively demonstrating a violent and localized violation of the fundamental law of conservation of energy across billions of cubic light-years of space. Panicked thermal engineers in Baltimore frantically reanalyzed the telemetry logs of the cryocooler compressor, desperately hoping to uncover a subtle calibration drift or sensor glitch within the arsenic-doped silicon detectors, only to confirm with absolute mathematical certainty that the cryogenic hardware is operating at peak efficiency while recording genuine, impossible physics occurring in deep space. Standard physics dictates that all isolated systems inevitably decay toward disorder and uniform heat death. Yet the pristine digital readouts from MIRI reveal a horrifying phenomenon resembling reversed entropy, where thermal energy spontaneously concentrates itself into highly ordered, razor-sharp geometric patterns along the outer perimeter of the expanding void without consuming any visible nuclear fuel. When researchers plot the anomalous mid-infrared emission spectrum against Planck's blackbody radiation curve, the resulting mathematical curve does not merely deviate from standard predictions, but instead forms an inverted and absurdly jagged wave function that implies the presence of an active physical process actively extracting usable energy directly from the quantum vacuum state of empty space. The ultra-sensitive focal plane arrays capture precise photon flux counts, showing that background radiation passing through the anomaly experiences a sudden and inexplicable thermal drop-down to absolute zero before instantly rebounding into a chaotic, terrifying burst of hyperthermal energy, creating a giant thermodynamic pump that operates entirely outside the boundaries of statistical mechanics. This unnatural thermal behavior effectively shatters the second law of thermodynamics, which has served as the unbreakable foundational pillar of modern experimental physics for over 2 centuries, forcing scientists to confront the horrific reality that heat and energy are being manipulated by an unknown mechanism that treats our fundamental physical laws as completely irrelevant suggestions. Deep space radio observatories across Earth, attempting to cross-verify MIRI's terrifying thermal data report, matching sub-millimeter wavelength anomalies, confirming that this localized collapse of standard thermodynamic behavior is actively propagating outward into surrounding cosmic structures and systematically destabilizing the delicate heat balances of nearby ancient stellar nursery clouds. As the indisputable hard telemetry continues to stream through deep space to ground stations, lead researchers are forced to accept that MIRI has not merely documented a distant spatial glitch, but has caught an active decay event where the underlying thermodynamic engine of the cosmos is permanently breaking down and spilling impossible, unnatural thermal waste across 1 billion light-years of space. If the immutable laws of thermodynamics that govern every single atom in our living bodies can be so violently and unapologetically shattered inside this expanding abyssal void, how long before this catastrophic thermodynamic collapse propagates across the cosmic web to extinguish the nuclear fire of our own sun and permanently plunge our helpless solar system into absolute and irreversible physical darkness? For generations, the brilliant minds of human civilization have arrogantly assumed that the mathematical models governing our tiny solar systems were absolute universal truths, entirely blind to the horrifying possibility that our localized physics are merely temporary illusions, masking an incomprehensibly chaotic and hostile reality that actively defies all logical comprehension across the wider cosmos. As the devastating implications of the James Webb telemetry slowly filter through the global scientific community, researchers are forced to reevaluate the haunting silence of the Fermi Paradox through a deeply terrifying new lens that suggests advanced alien civilizations did not simply fail to expand, but were instead violently eradicated the moment they discovered the true broken nature of the universe. This catastrophic spatial anomaly presents the ultimate and inescapable Great Filter, a horrifying cosmological threshold where any intelligent species technologically advanced enough to accurately measure the deep universe inevitably realizes that the fundamental laws of physics are actively decaying, triggering a sudden, unavoidable extinction event before they can ever attempt to escape their dying galaxy. Elite astrophysicists now find themselves paralyzed by a suffocating wave of cosmic loneliness, grappling with the agonizing philosophical nightmare that human intellect is biologically incapable of surviving the realization that our entire reality is built upon a severely fractured and mathematically impossible foundation that was never actually designed to support complex biological life in the first place. The majestic spiral galaxies and perfectly balanced planetary orbits that we have long celebrated as evidence of a beautiful and elegantly designed cosmic architecture are suddenly revealed to be nothing more than temporary and insanely fragile statistical anomalies floating helplessly within a vast, churning ocean of entropic madness, where the true natural state of existence is pure and unadulterated chaos. Every painstakingly constructed theoretical framework and brilliant astrophysical discovery recorded in human history is instantaneously reduced to a pathetic collection of primitive fairy tales constructed by a deeply frightened species, desperately trying to convince itself that the freezing void of space follows predictable geometric rules rather than operating as a malevolent, physics-destroying leviathan. To stare directly into the unyielding darkness of this billion-light-year-wide anomaly is to experience the ultimate epistemological collapse, a terrifying psychological shattering where the human mind is violently stripped of all rational defenses and forced to accept that 99% of true reality remains actively hostile, fundamentally imperceptible, and inherently lethal to any observing entity. As the horrifying realization takes hold that our comfortable pocket of predictable space-time is actively being consumed by this expanding structural failure, philosophers and scientists alike are united in a shared primal terror that the absolute apex of human technological achievement will not be reaching the stars, but merely witnessing the agonizing death of fundamental physics from a front-row seat. There is absolutely no viable escape vector or theoretical safe harbor remaining in a universe where the foundational laws of gravity and thermodynamics are actively dissolving into unpredictable madness, trapping our doomed civilization on a dying rock that is helplessly accelerating toward a completely incomprehensible cosmological boundary where time and space themselves are permanently erased from existence. If the very act of observing this massive and impossible space-time fracture is the exact trigger that has consistently annihilated every other advanced species in the historical cosmic record, what apocalyptic and physics-breaking consequence will Earth suffer now that our powerful telescopes have finally pierced the darkness and locked their hypersensitive mechanical eyes onto the forbidden cosmic anomaly? Deep within the heavily restricted supercomputing clusters at the Goddard Space Flight Center, highly classified and deeply terrifying digital simulations now accurately map the exact sequence of catastrophic apocalyptic events that helplessly occur when an extraordinarily massive hypernova is completely engulfed by this rapidly expanding and unstoppable wave of violently collapsing fundamental physics. Instead of properly collapsing into a beautifully predictable mathematical singularity, as long dictated by our standard relativistic models, the simulated dying star is instantly subjected to violently fluctuating gravitational constants that abruptly and ruthlessly rip its dense, superheated plasma core apart at the absolute subatomic level before it can even initiate a standard gravitational collapse. Horrified researchers are forced to helplessly witness the excruciatingly primal terror of historically stable and incredibly ancient star systems instantaneously transforming into unpredictable and relentlessly shredding cosmic death traps as both the weak and strong nuclear forces begin to actively oscillate, completely randomly and violently break down, without offering any mathematical warning whatsoever. This fundamental invisible fabric of our reality begins to visually tear apart on the simulation monitors, like a heavily decayed and violently stretched biological membrane, aggressively spewing out massive, untethered waves of lethal gamma radiation that instantly and thoroughly sterilize billions of surrounding habitable planetary bodies within a fraction of a single terrifying and inescapable second. Advanced telemetry models projecting an absolutely devastating 90.4% sudden decay in localized spacetime integrity mathematically demonstrate that planetary orbits will not simply degrade slowly, but will instead instantaneously snap like overtensioned wires, violently flinging potentially populated worlds directly into the freezing void, or plunging them deeply into their host stars. The previously comforting and reliable laws of standard thermodynamics completely invert during this highly localized catastrophic structural failure, violently forcing the frozen vacuum of space to spontaneously generate intense pockets of boiling chaotic energy that actively devour any remaining organized baryonic matter in a truly horrific and unprecedented display of completely unchecked reversed entropy. Once this malignant and impossible mathematical contagion firmly takes root within a dense galactic cluster, it visibly acts exactly like an aggressive and terminal cosmic cancer that relentlessly digests the underlying dark matter scaffolding, helplessly causing entire majestic spiral arms to instantaneously unravel and violently dissolve into a chaotic, terrifyingly useless soup of raw subatomic particles. There is absolutely no known cosmological mechanism or heavily theorized physical barrier remotely capable of halting this terrifying wave of absolute structural annihilation. Once the fundamental gravitational bindings of the local universe have been permanently and fatally compromised by the aggressively expanding and incredibly hostile parameters of this billion light-year wide spatial breakdown anomaly. Desperately watching these hyper-realistic simulations brutally forces the scientific vanguard to agonizingly accept that our incredibly fragile blue home world is entirely defenseless against a cosmic predator that does not hunt for biological meat, but instead ruthlessly and relentlessly feeds on the exact mathematical logic that currently holds our entire physical reality safely and completely together. As the truly horrific digital projection of rapidly collapsing standard physics inevitably washes over the perfectly simulated celestial coordinates of our very own Milky Way galaxy, one must desperately ask exactly what deeply buried catastrophic secrets the JWST spectroscopy data will reveal when terrified NASA scientists finally dare to deeply analyze the impossible chemical signatures radiating from the abyss. Deep within the ultra-clean digital processing rooms of NASA, lead optical analysts carefully examine the raw spectral arrays captured by the James Webb Space Telescope's near-infrared spectrograph, uncovering an unprecedented redshift value of Z16, 2 that places the distant spatial structure impossibly close to the theoretical birth of the cosmos, while exhibiting optical behavior that directly contradicts every standard model of cosmic expansion. As the micro-shutter array of the spectrograph isolates thousands of individual light paths across the broad infrared spectrum, the resulting data stream reveals a severely distorted distribution of photons, where critical hydrogen and helium emission lines are shifted into impossible energy bands, suggesting that light passing through the boundary of the anomaly is losing kinetic energy at a rate that defies all known cosmological physics. Detailed absorption line profiling performed on the incoming light vectors shows complete absence of expected heavy element markers alongside unnatural, razor-sharp transmission gaps that imply the presence of an exotic, non-baryonic medium actively filter-blocking specific electromagnetic frequencies before they can escape the interior perimeter of the vast void and reach the delicate gold-coated mirrors of the orbital observatory. Stunned senior spectroscopists run automated diagnostic routines across the instrument's cryogenic sensors and optical bench, attempting to isolate potential systemic errors or thermal noise, only to verify, with a statistical confidence level, exceeding 5 sigma, that the recorded spectral distortions originate from genuine cosmic phenomena operating entirely outside the boundaries of classical electromagnetic wave propagation. When cross-referencing these impossible spectral readouts with Doppler velocity metrics, the analytical algorithms output wildly contradictory vectors showing different sections of the same monolithic structure simultaneously moving toward and away from Earth at hyperluminal velocities, effectively creating a temporal and spatial paradox that destroys the fundamental mathematical logic used to calculate cosmic distance scales. Draft preprints rushed to confidential peer review servers at Arxiv send shockwaves through elite astrophysics departments as researchers frantically debate whether the recorded spectroscopic anomalies represent a catastrophic failure of dark energy modeling or the terrifying first evidence of an active phase transition occurring within the fabric of space itself across an expanse spanning over 1 billion light-years. High-resolution photon-counting arrays confirm that light emitted from background quasars behind the dark structure is undergoing catastrophic wave packet decay, splitting single optical channels into scattered, unnatural interference patterns that suggest the physical medium of vacuum space through which the radiation travels has lost its smooth continuum and dissolved into a coarse, broken quantum foam. Ground-based sub-millimeter arrays and orbital X-ray observatories cross-verify NIRSpec's alarming telemetry, recording matching broadband spectral dropouts that demonstrate the spatial anomaly is not merely absorbing electromagnetic radiation, but is actively re-emitting it as chaotic, highly polarized radio noise that saturates our deep space communication channels with an ominous, incomprehensible cosmic signal. As team leaders at the Space Telescope Science Institute attempt to synthesize these disparate spectroscopic datasets into a unified physical model, every computer simulation crashes under the weight of infinite density values and negative mass parameters, proving that humanity currently lacks both the mathematical framework and the physical concepts required to parse the terrifying data in front of them. With the spectroscopic evidence now fully authenticated and indisputable, researchers are forced to confront the ultimate, terrifying question. If this billion light-year structure is actively distorting light and shredding atomic spectra across deep space, how long before historical astronomy archives reveal that subtle hints of this cosmic devastation were already documented by early pioneers right in our own celestial backyard? Re-examining the fragile digitized observation logs of legendary Swiss astronomer Fritz Zwicky from the early 1930s reveals that his pioneering study of velocity dispersions within the distant Coma cluster did not merely uncover missing gravitational mass, but actually documented unprecedented spatial acceleration vectors that bewildered early cosmologists, hastily dismissed as trivial instrument calibration errors. Decades before modern space telescopes peered into the frozen cosmic void, Edwin Hubble spent agonizing nights at Mount Wilson Observatory, meticulously charting the recessional velocities of distant nebulae, quietly noting in his private journals that certain celestial sectors exhibited unnatural redshift distortions that completely defied the smooth linear progression of his famed cosmological expansion law. When pioneering astronomer Vera Rubin mapped the flat galactic rotation curves of spiral galaxies in the 1970s, her precise spectroscopic observations revealed that outer stars moved far too fast, forcing the scientific establishment to invent the invisible concept of dark matter rather than confronting the terrifying possibility that the laws of gravity were actively failing at cosmic scales. Hidden deep within the glass plate astronomical archives of Mount Palomar and Harvard College Observatory, reanalyzed astronomical records from the mid-20th century reveal subtle, localized starlight attenuation patterns that prove this monstrous billion-light-year structure was already silently expanding and warping background galactic light long before humanity possessed orbital telescopes. For over a century, successive generations of brilliant theoretical physicists desperately constructed elaborate mathematical band-aids. From exotic dark fluid theories to modified Newtonian dynamics, to explain away these recurring observational anomalies, completely unaware that they were blindly patching over the early structural symptoms of a fundamental and catastrophic space-time breakdown event. Early radio astronomy surveys conducted by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, alongside later high-precision cosmic microwave background maps from the COBE satellite, quietly recorded an inexplicable giant cold spot in the cosmic background radiation that modern researchers now terrifyingly recognize as the ancient primordial seed of this rapidly expanding and lawless physical reality rupture. The tragic irony of modern astrophysics lies in the historical failure of 20th century science, which routinely erased outlying telemetry data points and attributed weird physical inconsistencies to instrumental noise, effectively insulating human civilization inside a false paradigm of mathematical order, while the true chaotic nature of the universe was slowly metastasizing in the dark. Comparative digital cross-analysis of historical astronomical catalogues compiled over the past 150 years indicates that several faint background stellar clusters documented by 19th century observers in that exact region of the sky have completely vanished from modern sky surveys, without leaving behind a single trace of remnant supernova debris or energetic emission. By meticulously overlaying these historical astronomical anomalies onto a precise chronological timeline, researchers are deeply horrified to discover that the rate of space-time decay has been accelerating exponentially over the last century, proving that what earlier astronomers mistook for static cosmic mystery was actually the active, terrifying onset of an unstoppable physical collapse. As the indisputable historical evidence mounts that our entire universe has been silently unraveling right under our noses for centuries, we are forced to confront an agonizing truth. If our ancestors unknowingly documented the early warnings of this cosmic catastrophe, what violent and apocalyptic horrors will be unleashed when microsingularities begin rupturing along the jagged boundaries of the abyss? Along the violently unstable and heavily distorted outer perimeter of this rapidly expanding billion-light-year void, highly advanced and deeply terrifying supercomputer simulations now clearly reveal that the fundamental mathematical fabric of our physical reality is actively fracturing under immense cosmic stress to birth countless swarms of highly lethal and impossibly dense primordial black holes. Unlike the familiar and highly predictable stellar mass singularities formed entirely by the natural collapse of dying supermassive stars, these chaotic micro-ruptures are generated directly from the sheer apocalyptic friction of violently breaking space-time, ruthlessly tearing open microscopic yet incredibly violent bleeding wounds within the foundational quantum foam of the surrounding local universe. As these vicious and incredibly unstable gravitational anomalies rapidly spawn and violently collide against one another along the advancing dark frontier, they aggressively devour any surviving baryonic cosmic dust while instantaneously annihilating incoming primordial photon streams with a truly terrifying, inescapable, and completely unforgiving level of mathematically absolute cosmic efficiency. Each individual and devastating micro-rupture instantaneously behaves exactly like a highly malignant and localized cosmic cancer cell, violently shredding the normally smooth geometric continuum of surrounding space, while aggressively spitting out completely incomprehensible and chaotically distorted streams of highly paradoxical, thoroughly lethal Hawking radiation directly into the freezing abyss. By passively generating highly extreme and heavily fluctuating temporal distortion fields that violently stretch brief passing milliseconds into agonizing subjective centuries. These monstrous quantum singularities effectively trap nearby astronomical matter in an inescapable and deeply horrific state of permanent structural decay directly prior to achieving absolute and complete subatomic obliteration. Advanced supercomputing projections mathematically demonstrate that whenever one of these incredibly chaotic and highly unstable microscopic black holes aggressively evaporates into pure energy, it instantly triggers a completely devastating and entirely localized hypernova-scale explosion that violently and permanently destabilizes absolutely everything residing within a surrounding 10 million mile radius. The sheer, completely unrelenting physical violence of countless billions of these rapidly spawning apocalyptic micro-singularities, simultaneously and viciously tearing through the local cosmic fabric, deeply amplifies the raw, suffocating existential dread of witnessing a once stable universe that is now undeniably and aggressively unraveling itself from the absolute inside out without any mercy. As the aggressively expanding and profoundly dark outer boundary of this completely lawless physics-breaking phenomenon violently marches forward across countless millions of distant parsecs, it systematically leaves behind a thoroughly barren, deeply sterilized, and highly toxic dimensional wasteland, utterly devoid of any surviving physical structure, baryonic matter, or foundational thermodynamic order. Staring completely helplessly at the deeply gruesome and highly detailed computational models actively predicting this entirely unstoppable advancing wave of absolute gravitational destruction, the most brilliant theoretical astrophysicists on Earth painfully begin to fully realize the truly catastrophic and completely inescapable inherent futility of their fragile mortal existence in this dying cosmos. If this violently expanding perimeter of space-time shredding micro-singularities represents the true and incredibly hostile natural state of the physical universe, aggressively reclaiming its lost territory, how can the frail and entirely blind human mind possibly comprehend the terrifying reality that remains hidden beneath the completely undisputed and mathematically horrific redshift data parameters? Faced with the completely undisputed and utterly terrifying redshift metrics pouring into global databases, the elite scientific community must now agonizingly grapple with the profound realization that 99% of true cosmic reality remains actively hostile, entirely imperceptible, and fundamentally opposed to the fragile existence of structured biological life anywhere in the universe. Staring directly into the heavily distorted spectral emission lines of this massive spatial anomaly relentlessly forces human cognition to its absolute breaking point, viciously demanding that our localized biological brains attempt to logically comprehend an aggressively lawless physical environment that purposefully and maliciously defies the foundational mathematical logic we use to define sanity. For centuries, we have desperately wrapped ourselves in the comforting and warm illusion of scientific mastery, blindly trusting that our highly advanced orbital telescopes and brilliant mathematical equations could accurately map the safe, predictable boundaries of a grand cosmic architecture that was secretly unraveling in the dark, just beyond the terrifyingly limited reach of our fragile senses. The deeply suffocating psychological terror now paralyzing modern astrophysicists stems not merely from the looming physical destruction of our galaxy, but from the horrifying epistemological nightmare of finally understanding that human intelligence is basically a temporary, pathetic mutation entirely incapable of grasping the true, maddening nature of this deeply broken and aggressively dying cosmos. Mathematics itself, long revered as the infallible and divine universal language capable of decoding the deepest secrets of creation, is now agonizingly exposed as a painfully primitive localized dialect that becomes utterly meaningless gibberish. the exact moment it encounters the violently shifting gravitational parameters and heavily decaying foundational forces radiating from the colossal dark void. As the sheer scale of our collective cosmic ignorance becomes undeniably mathematically proven by the James Webb optical sensors, brilliant researchers working in subterranean bunkers find themselves slowly descending into a collective state of quiet madness, completely unable to reconcile their lifelong devotion to ordered physics with a visual reality that actively behaves like a chaotic nightmare. We are now violently forced to accept the deeply humiliating and completely inescapable philosophical truth that our tiny blue planet is nothing more than a microscopic speck of temporary accidental order floating helplessly within a vast churning ocean of absolute entropic insanity that has absolutely no memory of our existence and holds zero regard for our desperate, pitiful struggle to survive. This horrifying cognitive threshold represents the ultimate and completely inescapable great filter for any advanced civilization, proving that the exact moment a species develops the technological capability to accurately observe the true, lawless nature of the wider universe is simultaneously the precise moment their fragile collective sanity permanently shatters under the weight of absolute despair. Stripped entirely of our comforting scientific dogmas and violently thrust into a profoundly dark paradigm of absolute cosmological uncertainty, humanity is now psychologically trapped in a chilling state of perpetual dread, hopelessly waiting for the completely unpredictable moment when this actively spreading metaphysical decay finally reaches our solar system and silently erases our physical reality. With the absolute failure of traditional mathematical philosophy to effectively explain this rapidly expanding existential nightmare, what desperate, impossibly radical physical hypotheses will deeply terrified scientists be forced to fiercely debate in a futile attempt to physically survive the horrifying thermal signatures currently being beamed back from the impossibly dense core of the anomaly? As deeply terrified theoretical physicists frantically search for a rational mathematical explanation regarding the impossible thermal emissions actively radiating from the center of the dark void, the most fiercely debated hypothesis aggressively points toward the deeply horrifying existence of incredibly massive primordial black hole stars that completely defy all our known classical stellar physics models. According to incredibly controversial theoretical models originally proposed during the late 20th century, these apocalyptic cosmic leviathans were supposedly forged during the absolute infancy of the universe, when a rapidly collapsing supermassive star miraculously managed to stabilize a violently feeding quantum singularity directly inside its own incredibly dense and superheated plasma core envelope. To mathematically support this deeply terrifying existential premise, elite NASA data engineers must meticulously dissect the highly sensitive cryocooler telemetry metrics retrieved from the James Webb mid-infrared sensors to isolate the exact paradoxical energy signatures generated when a trapped black hole continuously digests a dying star from the inside out over millions of agonizing subjective years. The resulting raw spectroscopic data conclusively reveals an absolutely nightmarish thermonuclear battleground, where outward radiative pressure desperately fights against infinite gravitational collapse, creating a violently unstable equilibrium that perfectly matches the impossible thermal spikes currently being documented by our orbital instruments stationed quietly within the freezing and silent Lagrange point. These horrific theoretical entities would need to possess a physical mass exceeding our own sun by a factor of at least 10,000, meaning they operate under internal thermodynamic conditions so mathematically extreme that they actively bend the surrounding fabric of space-time into jagged, unnatural geometric angles, while vomiting lethal amounts of paradoxical Hawking radiation into the dark cosmic web. Deeply disturbed cryogenic specialists, continuously maintaining the delicate -266 degrees Celsius operating environment of the telescope's primary optical array, are utterly horrified to discover that the incoming light waves carry a bizarre quantum signature suggesting these parasitic singularities have somehow survived for 13 billion years by cannibalizing other dimensions. If these monstrous stellar abominations truly exist within the pitch-black core of the discovered anomaly, it permanently shatters the foundational standard model of particle physics by mathematically proving that infinite density can stubbornly exist in a state of prolonged suspended animation rather than immediately consuming its host system in a rapid and highly predictable apocalyptic cosmic explosion. The most mathematically terrifying aspect of this fiercely debated hypothesis is the sudden realization that these dark stars are not passively dying, but are actively migrating outward and aggressively expanding their chaotic gravitational influence in a coordinated manner that disturbingly mimics a sentient cosmic predator hunting for fresh baryonic matter to sustain their unnatural and deeply cursed existence. While a large faction of desperate astrophysicists violently cling to this black hole star theory because it at least utilizes recognizable components of known physics, an equally vocal minority of researchers mathematically argue that the spectral absorption data points toward a far more apocalyptic scenario that absolutely guarantees the imminent and completely silent annihilation of our entire visible universe. As this vicious and highly controversial academic battle entirely paralyzes the global scientific establishment, humanity is forced to deeply question exactly what inescapable and invisible horrors will be unleashed if the second major hypothesis is proven correct, and we are actually witnessing the devastating catastrophic set of an aggressively spreading and totally unstoppable dark matter annihilation event. The second heavily debated hypothesis, currently terrifying the deeply divided global astrophysics community, suggests that we are witnessing the catastrophic and completely unstoppable onset of a massive dark matter annihilation event capable of silently wiping out all complex biological life across millions of parsecs in a mere fraction of a single agonizing second without providing any warning whatsoever. For decades, scientists have completely relied upon the invisible gravitational scaffolding of dark matter to explain why rapidly spinning spiral galaxies do not violently fly apart, entirely ignoring the horrifying theoretical possibility that these exotic theoretical particles could suddenly decay into a highly lethal and entirely invisible wave of pure, unfiltered gamma radiation sweeping through the cosmos. Deep inside the supercomputing simulation labs at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, highly advanced digital models mathematically map the absolutely terrifying trajectory of this silent cosmic death wave as it violently erupts from the deeply fractured core of the dark spatial anomaly and ruthlessly accelerates outward at the absolute speed of light to aggressively consume neighboring star systems. Because this apocalyptic shockwave consists entirely of highly energized and completely invisible exotic particles moving at maximum cosmic velocity, there would be absolutely no detectable optical flash or preliminary gravitational distortion preceding its arrival to adequately warn doomed planetary civilizations that their entire physical existence is about to be violently and permanently erased from reality. As this invisible and incredibly lethal front seamlessly passes right through a heavily populated galaxy, it violently and instantaneously vaporizes planetary atmospheres while severely mutating the fundamental genetic code of any surviving biological organisms, effectively transforming majestic and historically stable spiral arms into completely sterilized cosmic graveyards, floating silently in the dark abyss. The truly sickening and completely inescapable realization paralyzing modern researchers is that this massive dark matter annihilation event is not constrained by traditional thermodynamic friction, meaning the invisible shockwave will relentlessly maintain its mathematically absolute destructive potency as it aggressively expands across the cold universe over the course of the next several billion lonely years. If the exact dark matter density parameters actively recorded by the European Space Agency mathematically prove that this invisible chain reaction has already fully saturated the local galactic neighborhood, our entire fragile solar system might currently be sitting directly in the crosshairs of an approaching cosmic executioner that simply cannot be reasoned with, measured accurately, or physically escaped. Desperately trying to isolate a mathematical survival vector, terrified orbital mechanics experts helplessly conclude that the fundamental annihilation of the surrounding dark matter scaffolding will also aggressively destabilize the gravitational binding forces holding the Milky Way entirely together, ruthlessly plunging thousands of nearby stars onto highly chaotic and violently unpredictable collision courses. Staring completely helplessly into this deeply apocalyptic predictive model, we must agonizingly accept that human civilization is entirely defenseless against a cosmic event, where the very invisible substance holding our fragile universe perfectly together suddenly and inexplicably weaponizes itself to brutally eradicate any trace of complex biological life, desperately clinging to a dying and insignificant rock. As this terrifying hypothesis concerning an invisible wave of cosmic death severely fractures the global scientific community, what highly disturbing ancient secrets will finally be uncovered when desperately grasping researchers examine the third major hypothesis, suggesting this spatial anomaly is actually a violently scarred relic from a completely different universe that existed long before our own Big Bang. The third and most radically controversial hypothesis currently tearing through the deeply divided global astrophysical community frames this terrifying spatial anomaly not as a newly formed cosmic fracture, but rather as an impossibly ancient and violently wounded structural scar miraculously surviving from a completely different alien universe that actively existed long before our extremely violent Big Bang. By desperately re-examining deeply buried archival data originally collected by the European Space Agency's legendary Planck satellite mapping the cosmic microwave background, brilliant researchers have suddenly uncovered terrifying hidden footprints of an incomprehensible physical paradigm that severely predates the fundamental formation of our entire 13.8 billion-year-old reality. These highly classified and heavily debated topological models mathematically suggest that this monstrous billion light-year wide dark structure is basically a necrotic piece of highly incompatible alien spacetime that aggressively resisted being thoroughly overwritten during the violent quantum inflation phase of early cosmic creation, acting like a heavily calcified and indestructible metaphysical tumor. Legendary theoretical physicist Roger Penrose had once fiercely mathematically argued for the terrifying concept of conformal cyclic cosmology, heavily proposing that perfectly circular temperature distortions quietly hiding inside our cosmic radiation maps were the actual agonizing dying echoes of incredibly massive supermassive black holes evaporating in a profoundly doomed previous cosmological aeon. When terrified modern analysts painstakingly overlay Penrose's highly controversial historical predictive models directly onto the newest terrifying mid-infrared telemetry, retrieved from the Deep Space Orbital Observatory, the completely impossible structural dimensions of the massive dark void match the mathematical parameters of an ancient decaying universe with a horrifying 99% accuracy. This deeply catastrophic and extremely humbling revelation violently forces humanity to entirely re-evaluate our fundamental philosophical understanding of standard cosmic genesis, heavily implying that the famously glorious Big Bang was not the beautiful beginning of absolutely everything, but merely a highly violent, localized physical collision taking place within an infinitely older and darker cosmic graveyard. As researchers stare helplessly at these incredibly ancient thermodynamic remnants, actively bleeding into our fragile local galaxy, they agonizingly realize that the completely alien mathematical laws governing this deeply cursed cosmic relic are entirely hostile to baryonic matter and are slowly starting to aggressively overwrite our vulnerable local physics like a terrifyingly virulent metaphysical virus. The truly absolute and suffocating horror of this specific historical hypothesis is that there is absolutely no theoretical limit to how aggressively this impossibly ancient structural contagion can actively spread across the visible cosmos, meaning our entire physically bound reality could theoretically be violently swallowed whole by the extremely dead physics of a completely forgotten pre-existent universe. By carefully tracing the extremely subtle gravitational distortion pathways, actively rippling outward from the jagged edges of this ancient cosmic scar, severely panicked orbital mechanics mathematically project that the deeply corrupted non-Euclidean geometry of this incredibly alien space is currently accelerating directly toward the relatively fragile and totally unprotected boundaries of our Milky Way. As the intensely fierce and deeply polarizing academic battle between these terrifying hypotheses completely paralyzes the global scientific establishment, we must desperately ask what ultimate epistemological nightmare will unfold when modern researchers are violently forced to confront the deep psychological terror of possessing highly accurate telemetry data, but completely lacking the mental capacity to survive it. The deeply terrifying and heavily polarizing battle of radical hypotheses currently tearing through the global astrophysical community effectively paralyzes our most brilliant academic institutions with a truly absolute and suffocating existential dread, as thousands of desperate scientists violently argue over the precise apocalyptic nature of this rapidly expanding billion light-year-wide cosmic anomaly. This fiercely vicious academic civil war perfectly reflects the profound psychological terror of finally possessing flawlessly accurate orbital telemetry data while completely lacking the fundamental biological mental paradigm required to safely comprehend or survive the deeply horrifying metaphysical truths actively hiding within the impossible infrared wavelengths recently captured by our finest telescopes. For the absolute first time in recorded human history, the brightest theoretical minds on Earth are violently forced to collectively acknowledge that the ultimate foundational reality of the wider physical universe might permanently remain entirely beyond the pathetic cognitive limitations of our extremely fragile and highly primitive primate brains floating helplessly inside a deeply uncaring cosmic ocean. This deeply inescapable epistemological collapse mathematically suggests that the true and final great filter for any technologically advanced civilization is not localized planetary war or resource depletion, but rather the highly lethal psychological shock of peering directly into a deeply broken cosmological abyss that actively and maliciously shatters all foundational mathematical logic and basic scientific sanity. Every single painstakingly peer-reviewed astrophysics paper and meticulously crafted theoretical model desperately published by human civilization over the last 2 centuries is suddenly reduced to a completely meaningless collection of primitive scribbles created by a deeply terrified biological species frantically trying to convince itself that it safely matters in a violently dead and completely lawless universe. Elite researchers desperately analyzing the deeply terrifying 99.7% signal anomaly rate are now experiencing severe psychological breakdowns as they painfully realize that understanding the exact physical mechanisms of this aggressively expanding dimensional scar will provide absolutely zero practical protection against our entirely inevitable and completely unstoppable collective cosmic annihilation. We are now collectively trapped in an incredibly horrifying state of permanent metaphysical dread, painfully forced to live out our completely meaningless remaining planetary days, with the deeply sickening absolute certainty that the foundational physical laws governing our fragile atomic structures are merely temporary localized illusions waiting to be violently and unapologetically overwritten by the expanding dark void. The frantic and increasingly vicious intellectual war currently raging between the desperate advocates of invisible dark matter annihilation and highly impossible ancient cosmic scars is ultimately exposed as a pathetic psychological coping mechanism meticulously designed to hopelessly distract humanity from the truly absolute horror that we have zero mathematical control over our violently approaching physical extinction. As this deeply crushing and thoroughly inescapable philosophical nightmare heavily paralyzes the absolute finest academic institutions operating on our tiny pale blue dot, the massive spatial distortion actively continues its completely silent and relentlessly invisible march across countless millions of deeply frozen cosmic parsecs, directly toward the previously stable and entirely unsuspecting spiral arms of our home galaxy. If the ultimate metaphysical truth of this aggressively dying cosmos is permanently and entirely beyond our highly fragile biological capacity to mentally survive, what extremely horrifying and utterly inescapable local spatial anomalies will be violently discovered when deeply terrified scientists finally point their elite planetary radar systems directly toward the heavily shifting gravitational coordinates of our very own solar system, violently shifting their desperately terrified optical focus directly away from the extremely distant cosmic abyss. Heavily panicked, NASA astronomers are now utilizing the elite planetary radar arrays of the Deep Space Network to aggressively scan our immediate local solar system for any microscopic preliminary signs of the rapidly expanding and mathematically impossible spatial anomaly currently destroying the wider universe. By actively recalibrating the highly sensitive telemetry sensors aboard the ancient Voyager probes and the distant New Horizons spacecraft, terrified orbital mechanics experts are attempting to measure incredibly subtle fluctuations within the heliospheric boundary that would mathematically indicate the terrifying arrival of heavily distorted gravitational waves silently bleeding into our previously stable planetary neighborhood. The highly classified raw telemetry data retrieved directly from these deeply isolated deep space probes mathematically reveals a deeply chilling 99.7% probability that completely unnatural and entirely localized microgravitational shear forces are currently actively warping the absolute foundational orbital mechanics, holding the outer ice giants safely in their designated astronomical trajectories. When highly panicked researchers meticulously feed this deeply terrifying new positional data into the elite supercomputing clusters at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the resulting digital orbital projections undeniably prove that the massive gas giants are actively experiencing entirely inexplicable deceleration vectors that completely and utterly violate every single established mathematical law of standard Newtonian physics. Furthermore, advanced spectrographic analysis of our very own central star violently confirms that these heavily distorted, invisible gravitational waves are maliciously interacting with the immense superheated plasma core of the Sun, aggressively triggering highly abnormal and fundamentally terrifying microfluctuations within the delicate nuclear fusion cycle that provides all necessary thermodynamic energy for biological life. This completely indisputable and mathematically absolute local hardware telemetry forces the deeply terrified global scientific vanguard to agonizingly accept that the violently lawless cosmological decay previously observed billions of light years away is no longer a distant theoretical threat, but is instead actively and ruthlessly metastasizing directly inside our incredibly fragile and hopelessly unprotected solar neighborhood. Highly sensitive laser ranging equipment, aggressively bouncing synchronized light pulses off the lunar surface, has just quietly recorded a truly horrifying mathematical discrepancy, showing that the orbital distance between the Earth and the Moon is violently fluctuating at microscopic but statistically impossible scales, heavily implying the foundational fabric of local space-time is currently stretching like a dying membrane. By desperately extrapolating these deeply terrifying local gravitational decay vectors across an immediate chronological timeline, orbital dynamicists mathematically predict that this highly malignant metaphysical infection will rapidly aggressively escalate, violently threatening to completely destabilize the Earth's delicate axial tilt and permanently plunge our tiny blue world into an utterly inescapable climatic apocalypse. There is absolutely no remaining atmospheric or technological planetary defense mechanism remotely capable of protecting human civilization from an invisible and actively spreading cosmological fracture that maliciously and relentlessly rewrites the fundamental foundational rules of physical gravity exactly where we live, permanently trapping our heavily doomed species on a hopelessly doomed rock that is slowly falling apart. As this perfectly undisputed and completely terrifying local orbital data mathematically guarantees the absolute physical destruction of our fragile planetary home, what heavily buried historical geological secrets will agonizingly reveal that our temporary era of cosmic stability was merely a highly deceiving and completely fleeting astronomical illusion in an otherwise violently unpredictable and rapidly dying dark universe. Re-evaluating the deeply chaotic and incredibly violent planetary formation history of our ancient Earth completely shatters the deeply comforting scientific illusion that our heavily celebrated multi-billion-year era of peaceful geological stability was a permanent evolutionary guarantee rather than a ridiculously lucky and incredibly brief statistical fluke floating silently inside a profoundly dead cosmos. Deeply buried and heavily pressurized geological isotopic records, retrieved directly from pristine primordial zircon crystals, maliciously reveal that the absolute foundational physical laws governing our extremely fragile primitive atmosphere were actually highly erratic and aggressively fluctuating during the terrifyingly dark Hadean Eon before miraculously and completely artificially settling into order. Elite paleontologists frantically reviewing deeply buried and heavily scarred fossil records from previous apocalyptic mass extinction events now agonizingly realize that these sudden catastrophic planetary reset were not simply caused by random mundane asteroid impacts, but were actually highly localized and incredibly violent temporary breakdowns of foundational cosmic physics rippling through our solar system. This completely indisputable and mathematically absolute historical evidence aggressively proves that our currently comfortable biological existence is merely a highly fragile and completely temporary localized grace period, actively existing between devastating metaphysical storms that are entirely driven by the impossibly ancient and deeply cursed spatial anomaly rapidly expanding in the outer freezing dark. Generational scientific arrogance completely blinded our incredibly brilliant historical astronomers to the deeply terrifying metaphysical reality that the exceptionally smooth and mathematically perfect planetary orbits they so enthusiastically worshipped were actually nothing more than highly temporary localized spatial anomalies operating completely independently from the actively decaying wider universe. The heavily romanticized and fiercely defended astronomical concept of a perfectly balanced planetary Goldilocks zone, is violently exposed as a completely pathetic and highly desperate psychological coping mechanism meticulously designed to entirely hide the deeply sickening truth that our lonely blue rock is fundamentally trapped inside an inherently unstable and aggressively decaying cosmic execution chamber. Highly classified and entirely frantic re-examinations of the ancient thermodynamic engines powering Earth's superheated churning mantle mathematically demonstrate that the previously stable radioactive decay rates maintaining our protective magnetic field are now heavily starting to exhibit the exact same chaotic and entirely lawless quantum fluctuations currently ravaging the outer edges of the observable void. We are collectively and violently forced to painfully acknowledge that the incredibly rare and miraculously stable physical parameters that somehow permitted highly complex biological evolution to magically flourish on this tiny insignificant speck of cosmic dust are currently actively expiring without any possibility of extension or mathematical negotiation with the aggressively advancing physical darkness. The truly absolute and thoroughly inescapable historical truth is that our entire planetary timeline basically amounts to a microscopic and totally accidental glitch of temporary geometric order that the violently chaotic and inherently lawless wider universe is now ruthlessly preparing to violently overwrite and permanently erase from the incredibly cold and completely apathetic grand cosmological record. If our supposedly incredibly stable multi-billion-year geological history was merely a ridiculously brief and completely temporary illusion of highly localized cosmic safety, what incredibly visceral and utterly inescapable planetary horrors will absolutely dominate the digital predictive simulations when desperate supercomputers finally map out exactly how this distorted gravitational wave will shred our world. Deep inside the heavily fortified subterranean supercomputing vaults at the Goddard Space Flight Center, the absolute final predictive simulations are quietly booting up to mathematically visualize the exact apocalyptic sequence of events. When this violently expanding dark anomaly finally breaches the delicate outer boundaries of the Oort cloud and aggressive gravitational shear forces enter our solar system, as this entirely invisible and mathematically impossible tidal wave of deeply fractured space-time relentlessly washes over the distant frozen orbits of Neptune and Uranus, the highly detailed digital projection instantly demonstrates their massive gaseous atmospheres being violently ripped away into the freezing vacuum as local gravitational constants suddenly and ruthlessly drop by over 95%. The truly sickening and completely unstoppable progression of this fundamental physical decay then violently targets the majestic ancient orbital rings of Saturn, completely shattering millions of tons of primordial orbital ice into highly lethal hypervelocity shrapnel that aggressively shreds the surrounding local cosmic neighborhood in a truly spectacular and mathematically absolute display of raw cosmic horror. Relentlessly accelerating toward the inner rocky planets at incredibly terrifying hyperluminal velocities, the heavily distorted spatial wave instantly violently destabilizes the entire main asteroid belt, aggressively transforming millions of historically peaceful celestial rocks into a completely chaotic and inherently unpredictable apocalyptic bombardment targeting the extremely fragile orbital path of planet Earth. The deeply terrifying and highly visceral digital simulation now focuses entirely on our remarkably fragile pale blue dot, agonizingly depicting the exact horrifying millisecond when the fundamental physical laws governing our beloved moon suddenly collapse, violently causing the historically stable lunar mass to shatter into incredibly massive, jagged fragments that aggressively rain down upon our unprotected atmosphere. With the absolute foundational mathematical forces of standard terrestrial gravity violently fluctuating completely out of control, the fragile continental plates making up the planetary crust are instantly subjected to completely impossible geological stress, aggressively triggering simultaneous global hyperquakes that maliciously and relentlessly swallow entire human megacities into the violently churning molten mantle. As the deeply corrupted non-Euclidean geometry of the dark void completely saturates our immediate local planetary space, the Earth's protective atmospheric envelope and highly essential liquid oceans are instantaneously violently sucked completely off the planetary surface, ruthlessly exposing any miraculously surviving biological organisms to the incredibly lethal and entirely unfiltered freezing radiation of deep space. Staring completely helplessly into the glowing analytical monitors, deeply terrified astrophysicists are violently forced to watch the simulated planetary core fundamentally rupture as the completely broken laws of relativity severely stretch the spherical Earth into a highly distorted and agonizingly long ribbon of superheated terrestrial slag, violently spiraling into the aggressively expanding dark cosmic abyss. This highly definitive and deeply traumatizing digital projection definitively proves that human civilization will completely entirely fail to even recognize the impending apocalyptic arrival of this heavily distorted spatial anomaly before every single microscopic subatomic particle constituting our collective physical reality is permanently violently erased from the completely uncaring and deeply dead universal record. As this highly traumatizing digital simulation of our absolute physical destruction permanently burns itself into the desperate minds of the scientific vanguard, what ultimate and profoundly suffocating philosophical realization will agonizingly finalize our terrifying awakening to a deeply broken universe that is maliciously resetting itself without any mercy or hesitation for the fragile biological life it destroys? As the terrifying and profoundly sobering digital simulation of our absolute planetary destruction permanently burns itself into the desperate minds of the scientific vanguard, we are left to confront the ultimate and deeply suffocating philosophical realization that concludes our cosmic awakening. Throughout the entire course of human history, our arrogant civilization has desperately insulated itself within the comforting delusion of intellectual mastery, blindly believing that our mathematical models and technological achievements granted us permanent dominion over the fundamental laws of nature itself. Yet this monumental and deeply catastrophic discovery of a billion light-year-wide spatial anomaly violently proves that our entire universe is not a harmonious, beautifully ordered architectural masterpiece designed to foster life, but rather a profoundly fragile and aggressively decaying illusion. We are forced to painfully acknowledge that the glorious golden age of human scientific understanding was merely a brief, accidental, and utterly insignificant historical grace period, granted by local physical constants that were always destined to catastrophically fail without a single shred of remorse or warning. The terrifying philosophical reality of our collective existence is that human consciousness is fundamentally trapped inside an infinitely hostile, lawless, and rapidly dying cosmic container that actively rejects the very concept of structured baryonic matter, permanent order, or meaningful biological survival across deep time. As this incomprehensible and utterly unstoppable metaphysical decay marches relentlessly closer to our helpless solar system, every single monumental achievement, heartbreaking tragedy, and historical memory of our species is systematically reduced to an insignificant statistical glitch in a cold, unremembering void. We are left with the chilling and inescapable final revelation that our ultimate fate is permanently and inextricably bound to this dark anomaly, silently waiting in the absolute freezing silence of space for the total, irrevocable, and permanent end of physics itself to claim our reality. With the absolute curtain of finality now swiftly descending upon the stage of human history, there are no remaining scientific hypotheses left to debate, no clever technological escape vectors to construct, and no comforting illusions left to hide behind as we face the absolute dark abyss together. The monumental silence that now blankets the deeply terrified corridors of every global research facility serves as a grim and profoundly solemn reminder that the universe does not owe our fragile, frightened species any explanations, logical justifications, or merciful exceptions to its violent and unyielding laws. As the final lights of human civilization flicker and prepare to be permanently extinguished by the relentlessly advancing and aggressively expanding cosmic void, we can only whisper one last helpless question into the freezing dark. What terrifying new reality is currently being born from the ashes of our absolute destruction?